if you have a chance to visit Victoria between late April and early May, you should definitely go see blue-purple flowers of the Camas in the Garry Oak Meadow. In Canada, Garry Oak Meadows are only found in southwestern British Columbia, mostly on Vancouver Island and nearby small islands. Garry Oak Meadows are adapted to wet, mild winters and dry, warm summers of this region's unique climate, known as a sub-Mediterranean climate. Uplands Park is one of the places where Garry Oak Meadows are preserved, and you can see wild flowers of the camas and other rare native plants in spring. Garry Oak Meadows, also known as Garry Oak ecosystems, are grassy meadows of native plants mixed with open woodlands of oak trees named Garry Oak. The camas is an iconic native plant of Garry Oak Meadows on Vancouver Island. The camas is part of the history of Garry Oak Meadows and the culture of Indigenous people. Indigenous families tended the meadows and harvested camas bulbs as a staple food. Camas bulbs provided Indigenous families with much-needed carbohydrates. Camas bulbs were cooked in the fire pit all day, or even longer, until they became sweet enough to eat. After being cooked, many camas bulbs were often dried, sometimes pounded into a powder, and preserved to be used later. Besides being a staple food, camas bulbs were a precious commodity for indigenous trade. Camas bulbs were traded among indigenous tribes in exchange for many different items, including food and materials for daily life or ceremonial use. Cultural burning is fire used by indigenous people to sustain natural environment and cultural practices for subsistence on the land. For thousands of years, Indigenous people have periodically burned Garry Oak Meadows to maintain health and productivity of the lands for hunting deer and growing camas and other plants for food and medicine. Cultural burning rejuvenated the meadows with new growth of native plants. It also prevented shrubs and conifer trees from taking over grassy meadows, while keeping woodlands open with large Garry Oak trees. In the mid-1800s, European settlers arrived in large numbers in British Columbia, including Vancouver Island. The newcomers suppressed fires on Garry Oak Meadows. Indigenous people were no longer able to practice cultural burning, and the health and productivity of Garry Oak Meadows began to decline. Eventually, indigenous people were displaced from their traditional lands. Without cultural burning and indigenous caretakers of the lands, Garry Oak Meadows have been taken over by shrubs and conifer trees. Over time, Most Garry Oak Meadows have become agricultural lands or being developed into urban areas. Today, Garry Oak Meadows are critically endangered. Less than 5% of the original Garry Oak Meadows remain in natural conditions. The native biodiversity of oak meadows has been continuously threatened by invasive non-native plants and animals. Even if you didn't know the history and story of the Camas and Indigenous people on Garry Oak Meadows, you would enjoy the beauty of Camas Flowers in a picturesque meadow, surrounded by giant oak trees. I'm hoping that knowing the history and story of lands and people would make it a very special experience when you visit to see an oak meadow filled with stunning Camas flowers in person one day. Then, just maybe, the landscape and scenery become a bridge between the past and future. You might try to imagine how the life on Garry Oak Meadows must have been like in the old days, with a growing desire to preserve the precious nature and culture of Garry Oak Meadows for future generations. This land by the sea leads to Cattle Point. Before the settlers came, the Checonian family of the Lekwungen people had lived throughout the area, known today as Oak Bay, including Uplands Park and Cattle Point, and also lived around bays farther to the north. The Checonian family with other families became the Songhees First Nation. Today, the Lekwungen peoples are the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. From 1860 to 1910, Cattle Point was a place for steamboats to unload cattle to be delivered to the settlers. Cattle were pushed overboard near the point and forced to swim to the shore.